Congressman Eli Crane, welcome to the Signal Sitdown.
Thanks for having me, Bradley.
Of course. Now, bombshell report that got very little fanfare, but it confirms what folks like you have been saying about the Ukraine war the entire time. I'm going to read part of it now. The title of the story from the New York Times is called The Partnership, The Secret History of the War in Ukraine. Here's a quote. Side by side in a German mission command center, American and Ukrainian officers planned Kiev's counteroffensives. A vast American intelligence collection effort both guided big-picture battle strategy and funneled precise targeting information down to Ukrainian soldiers in the field. One European intelligence chief recalled being taken aback to learn how deeply enmeshed his NATO counterparts had become in Ukrainian operations. Quote, "They are now part of the kill chain now," end quote. In mid-2022, this is later on in the story, in mid-2022, using American intelligence and targeting information, the Ukrainians unleashed a rocket barrage at the headquarters of the 58th in the Kherson region, killing generals and staff officers inside. Again and again, the group set up at another location. Each time, the Americans found it and the Ukrainians destroyed it. At the height of Ukraine's 2022 counteroffensive, a pre-dawn swarm of maritime drones with support from the Central Intelligence Agency, attacked the port, damaging several warships and prompting the Russians to begin pulling them back. It's exactly what we've been saying the entire time, that the Biden administration got us way further into the war than they would like to admit.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when I look at this whole situation as a former warfighter myself, I've just been concerned about it the entire time. It seems like we just go from never-ending war to never-ending war. And, you know, after 5, 10, 20 years, then we look back on, you know, whatever war or conflict we were in, and we have to ask ourselves a couple hard questions. Was this worth the blood and treasure that we spent? Because it's kind of sad, Bradley, but when you're up here, you realize how many people who have never been to war, never buried a buddy, never had to go console a Gold Star, you know, mother, who are just up here voting for, you know, these never-ending wars left and right. It's almost as if they've never seen a war that they didn't want us to be involved in. It's almost as if they're incapable of asking the question, why are we involved in this war? What's going to cost? What is it going to cost us? How many American lives are going to be lost, in this war? And it's just, trust me, Bradley, when I tell you, I'm all about us having a strong military. I still have a lot of buddies running around all over the world, and I want them to be as safe. I want them to have the best gear they can possibly have. But oftentimes they're not the ones making the decisions on which wars we get involved in. And when you're basically fighting a proxy war, and I mean some of the story that you just read, I think alluded to that, our involvement not only in funding this Ukrainian war effort, but also the intelligence that we've been supplying, to this war effort. It's just, you've got to start asking yourself those serious questions. And I don't think a lot of our folks, really ask those questions.
And you were one of the few members of Congress who was out in front of this, who saw the Ukraine war for what it was. It was a proxy war against Russia.
Right.
And it was a bank shot way of trying to start regime change in Russia. I know that people don't want to admit that, but they keep saying it on social media. So I guess I'll take them at their word that they don't want Putin in charge of Russia. Who the heck takes Putin's place? They never, ever suggest that. Maybe Alexei Navalny, who has zero support, is more of a Western icon. And sure, people who stand up to mean governments and bad guys deserve some credit, but to pretend as if that was a legitimate alternative to governance in Russia, I think was silly. Over that period of time, though, you saw a lot of folks in your party start to change their message on Ukraine after what happened in February of 2022. It seems like most of the Republican Party were all in. And not a lot of them, though they've kind of changed their tune, have admitted that they were wrong. I mean, what's preventing them from admitting that they were wrong? What's the type of change of heart that you see your fellow Republicans in Congress had on the Ukraine war?
Well, it has been interesting. It has been interesting to watch, that change of heart. I think often the change of heart comes when you go back home and, you start talking to constituents who are, having a tough time making it, just because of our economy, or they have a son who was killed in Iraq or Afghanistan, asking those questions that I talked to you about. But I want to go back to something we were talking about a second ago, fighting a proxy war against Russia, right? And wanting regime, that's one of the, I don't want to say theories, but, one of the things that gets thrown around. I don't think a lot of Americans have actually played this out very far. And definitely, I don't think a lot of the war hawks or neocons in DC have played this out. What's that going to look like when, right, wrong, or indifferent, you push Vladimir Putin to the point where he, starts dropping tactical nuclear weapons, or, let's say this, evolves into a nuclear war, right? The Russians have more nuclear weapons than anybody on the planet. What would that look like? Could you honestly sit here and say that, if you see Chicago or New York or San Francisco or, any of our other major cities go up in a mushroom cloud, right? That this was worth it. Mm-hmm. And you have to start asking yourself those serious questions. If you're going to engage in this type of regime change or fighting proxy wars around the world. And I just don't think many people think it through. And when the crazy thing too is when you look at how much the hundreds of billions of dollars that we've sent over there, and Congress refused to audit that money. I mean, that should be a bare minimum right there, right? And then you hear Zelensky himself, come out and publicly say that he's only gotten like 80 or 90 billion dollars, while many of us have been saying that, they're skimming money off the top left and right over there, and then you go even further and listen to people who are thinking it out even further, and they're saying, hey, what you guys have sent over there now is going to be peanuts in compared to what we're going to spend to rebuild Ukraine, right? Mm-hmm. And so thankfully we have individuals on our side of the aisle, and that are really thinking these questions through. And I think so much of where people stand, honestly, comes down to what they intake, what media they're listening to. And I'm grateful to, listen to some, pretty strong, rational individuals who are asking these big questions.
Yeah, I'm not reading the pages of the Wall Street Journal opinion page anymore, really. It feels like every single time I read them, they want me to go fight in a war. One thing I think that shocked me, and maybe it shocked you, was how in the previous Congress, it appeared as if Republican leadership threw out all the stops to get more money for foreign countries, when obviously the American people were way more concerned with other problems.
Right.
When we looked at that MERV that they did with the supplemental, and if people don't know what a MERV is, it basically means that you are able to take several different votes on one piece of legislation that will all be bundled together afterwards. Now, we didn't think about using the MERV for funding or for securing the border or any of the other priorities that the American people wanted. We did it to get funding for China, which is where we should be spending our military dollars, probably. We did it to get funding for Israel, even though Israel is fully capable and always wanting to buy more American weaponry from their own treasury. And we did it to spend $60 billion on the continuation of the Ukraine war. And so it's just as you were saying, these people aren't really attached to the realities on the ground. They're not attached to, they're not thinking things through. They're not seeing it for the long game. They do this little procedural mechanism to keep the gravy train going. And it's out, it outrages people. And I think that's right to be outraged by it.
Yeah. And you pointed out something, I think that, is so important, because I talked about, you know, I think one of the reasons that members of Congress have started to change their tune is when you have to go back home and you have to talk to your constituents. One of the things that, you know, even though a lot of constituents don't follow politics all day, you know, because they're so busy working, taking care of their families, etc., they have a lot of common sense. And when they ask, you know, which one of my kids is going to have to die on this foreign battlefield, or how much is it going to cost? You know, they're asking a lot of good questions. And one of the other questions they're asking is, hey, why don't you guys secure the border? You know, why don't you guys invest in American infrastructure? You know, the roads around here look like trash. Our airport looks like trash, yet you're sending hundreds of billions of dollars over to Ukraine. And I just think it's so important. That's why I love the America First movement. And one of the things I was calling for the entire time was peace talks, right? Peace talks. You would think that would be like a bipartisan, you know, approach around here, but you know, it's wild that, you know, for years that was not the case at all. And Bradley, that's not because I want to see Russian aggression or Ukrainian, you know, civilians, you know, just hanging out in their apartment, taking a missile to their apartment complex or anything like that. But you got to start asking those tough questions.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think anyone will deny that the Ukrainian people are a brave people. I just think that the argument is, are they being served properly by their government?
Right.
And what we've seen time and time again is mega yachts and mega mansions and sports cars bought by these people who are supposed to be the folks leading the nation to victory. And that just seems like they're interested in lining their own pockets, Zelensky included. Sometimes it feels like that, even though, you know, if Zelensky keeps around him all of these figures that are guilty of this, then it does raise some legitimate questions. You mentioned the America First movement and peace talks. Trump was ripped on the campaign trail for suggesting that we need to put an end to the Ukraine war. He's being ripped now for suggesting that he needs to have serious peace talks, not only with Vladimir Putin to end the Ukraine war, but also, you know, Hamas or any of the other adversaries in wars that broke out all over the world when Joe Biden was president. What do you make of President Trump's foreign policy message at the moment?
You know, I love what he's doing, you know, especially as we talk about Ukraine. I love that, you know, and let's be honest, Bradley, the president couldn't suggest anything without getting, you know, ripped apart by the mainstream media. I mean, they hate his guts. They hate everything that he stands for. I do believe he stands for the people. You know, it's often interesting to me that a billionaire from New York City can actually come to rural Arizona and have a hero's welcome. Not because he was a billionaire, not because he's from New York City, but because he actually cares about them. And they don't just hear it in his words, but they see it in his actions. Like, you know, before I ran for office, I watched President Trump in his first term actually try and keep every promise that he made the American people. And unfortunately, sometimes it was Republicans, you know, who were shutting him down and stopping his agenda, you know, and, you know, so I'm all about the America First movement, and I'm grateful, you know, for the president in trying to bring peace in the Middle East, trying to bring, you know, broker peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. And I think even kind of trying to realign us geopolitically, as you know, I think a lot of what he's doing is kind of like Monroe Doctrine 2.0 and trying to lock down the Western Hemisphere. And at the same time, trying to prevent us from this idea that we should be some world police force.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier, you know, a lot of these Republicans or Democrats who walk around Capitol Hill and talk about the next war, whether that's with Iran or China or Russia, full-on Russia war. They've never had to bury a buddy. They've never had to talk to a Gold Star family in a personal way. You have, because you are a former Navy SEAL. Tell our audience your history being a Navy SEAL, serving in the United States Navy, what you learned when you were there.
Yeah, for me, I was pretty fortunate to get to serve in that capacity, but I actually dropped out of school my senior year at the University of Arizona to the week after 9/11 to go join the Navy in hopes of becoming a Navy SEAL. Unfortunately, I didn't make it through the pipeline my first time, so I spent about 2.5 years on a ship and got a chance to go through SEAL training again. And then I went to SEAL Team 3. I did 3 deployments there, and I'm grateful for my time. I learned so much in that community. I kind of grew up in that community, but it was some of those experiences and some of the things that I saw overseas and just how we were conducting business over there has really, in many ways made me rethink my own foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. And so special operators, SEAL teams, etc., these guys are often folks way out in front of where the official U.S. position is. That much seems to be true in Ukraine, whether those are logistics supports or what we learned from this story, logistics, operations, maybe some special forces, etc. I mean, how many people do you think the United States has in Ukraine right now? Because what we've tried to figure out from the start of this Ukraine war is how much money have we actually spent on it? And the Biden administration, I mean, I know you sent letters. I know when J.D. Vance was a senator, he was sending letters. We were writing about them saying none of the math adds up. Nobody knows how much money we've spent. And that was just the first question. The second question is, well, if we're spending all that money, we must have people there, right? So how many people do we have there? And that was a verboten conversation.
Yeah.
But with your inside knowledge, I mean, what do you think the presence actually is for the United States in that
Honestly, Bradley, I don't know. I do know guys that, that I've worked with and have worked in, my community that have been over there. But to me, it's not even the biggest question. Again, the biggest questions come back to what we talked about in the beginning. Mm-hmm. Why are we doing this? Is the juice worth the squeeze, right? How many Americans are going to die? What's that tipping line before an all-out war with Russia? Can we afford it? Could we even win that war? Right? It was as I watched the military become what it's become, and just completely inundated with DEI. Often, I'm very concerned for many of the people that I know within the military, just because we've gone from having a military that was focused on lethality to, in many ways, a military that's often distracted by, many of these woke, cultural agendas like diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's interesting because when I went into the military, got individuals that were colorblind.
They weren't asking you what gender you were?
No. Or even if you had flat feet or you had asthma or whatever it was, you couldn't get into the military because the military wasn't about inclusivity and diversity and equity. It was about lethality. And if you couldn't do the job, if you couldn't, perform at the highest level, if you were going to be a burden in any way on your unit or the overall force, you weren't allowed. And I think that was accepted by, Americans at large because they understood the importance of it. And fast forward a couple decades later, and I mean, it's like, the military's doing sex changes for people, and it's just bizarre to me.
Pregnancy suits for air women and all this random baloney. And I'm not from a military family. One of the most interesting dynamics that I didn't know about until coming to Washington, D.C. and, doing foreign policy with people who actually have military experiences, like the differences between SEAL culture and Delta culture and all this different stuff. I think, everyone in the United States associates SEALs with lethality, right? If that message is still accepted in the military and accepted amongst the American populace, it is with the Navy SEALs. Yeah. Which brings us to what Defense Secretary Hegseth is doing. You'd mentioned it, lethality. He's mentioned it a million times. Lethality, that is his focus. What do you make of what Mr. Hegseth is doing over at the Pentagon?
So far I love what I see him doing. I love that he's getting out there and he's not only visiting the installation, but you see him working out with the boys. That's something that goes. It's hard. It's hard to even equate how far that goes, but he's really, in my opinion, changing the culture. Not only with eliminating a lot of the DEI and woke programs, but just in leading and showing the boys or our
some of them troops, boys, some of them men, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Showing our troops that he's willing to get down and dirty and, work out with them and hang out. That's not something you see a lot. That's not something you see a lot from generals or admirals, let alone the Secretary of Defense. And so that's one of the things that I liked about Pete. He was younger, one of the other things I liked about him, Bradley, is that he didn't come up through, the same system that a lot of these guys come up through. He was doing a different job. And I don't think because of that, I don't think that he got influenced too heavily. Like I see a lot of these generals and admirals that I talk to up here on Capitol Hill. It was wild. I was in a briefing with a bunch of high-ranking admirals within the Navy, and they were talking to us about, some of the funding they needed, for our fleet. And there were a couple conservatives in this meeting, and it was actually in the skiff under the Capitol, in a secret, compartmentalized space. And they were talking to us about this funding that they needed. And many of the conservatives were like, hey, we get it, Admiral. We're all about helping you fund the fleet. But what we're not all about is a lot of the DEI stuff that's going on. And can you talk to us a little bit about that and how much you guys are spending on those type of programs? And I kid you not, every single one of them, because many of them are, ticket punchers who are more concerned about their own careers than they are about the strength and the focus of the military, looked at us and said, hey, diversity is our strength. It was almost like they were just reading off the talking points from the Department of Defense. And it was so disappointing to see. I'm not really surprised, but that in many ways, that was just a reflection of what our military had become.
It's not happening, and it's good that it is.
Right.
And I'm so glad that you brought up that point about the top brass and the pipelines. A friend of mine once observed that war got a whole lot worse and a whole lot bloodier and a lot less honorable when generals stopped fighting in the field. And that's kind of what I think Pete is trying to recover. Obviously he can't be out there, but I think there's an element of what he's trying to recover there by working out with the troops, by spending time in training with the troops, and trying to recover that type of honorable service. I mean, Mark Milley's going to go out there. Like, Mark Milley probably can't even do a pull-up. Who are we kidding? But that does it for the fights abroad. And let's talk about the fights here at home, particularly across the street over at Capitol Hill. Right now, a rogue judiciary is trying to hamper the president, the only official in the United States government elected by every American.
Right.
You have moved to do something about these rogue activist lower court judges that are issuing all sorts of injunctions on the Trump administration by filing articles of impeachment. That is one of many different policy options that Republicans in Congress have on the table. First, tell us a little bit about the impeachment effort, and then we'll talk about some of those other options.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's start big picture here, right? And you covered it a little bit. I think there's about 670 district judges around the country. And, not one of them, to your point, was elected by, the entire American populace. President Trump was. And he definitely has, serious constitutional powers, right, as the chief executive, the commander in chief. And basically, and this is just the way I see it. I know not everybody sees it this way, but the Democrats don't control the House, they don't control the Senate, and they don't control the presidency. But one thing that they do have is a lot of radical activist judges. And that's the play call right now. The play call is to use radical activist judges and also protesters, often paid, to stir things up and try and stop the agenda. And so it's interesting, Bradley, because when I talk to Republicans, especially in the last year, the election year, you would hear many of them say that, hey, if Kamala Harris wins, this republic is likely done, right? That's where we're at right now. When you look at the border, when you look at spending, when you look at the government targeting political opponents, and on and on and on, this experiment is done if Kamala Harris wins. I don't know if you ever heard anybody say that.
Oh, I heard it. Absolutely.
Okay, so we're hearing the same things, right? And so to me, and honestly, I believe that there was, definitely an ounce of truth in what they were saying, just because of the trajectory that we were on, right? So if you do believe that, there should be a certain level of, urgency, right? Because we don't have a lot of time with President Trump. We only have about 4 years, and we're still dealing with a lot of the same issues and cleaning up a lot of the same issues, right? And then you also hear many of my colleagues talk about, well, if the Democrats take power again, they're going to blow up the Supreme Court. They're going to allow, many of these, they're going to allow many of these other jurisdictions to have, congressional votes and whatnot. And so, it's just interesting because it's like many of these people that say that there's some urgency and imminence to the situation that we find ourselves in are completely unwilling to fight as if that's the case. And when I see these individual judges that are trying to stop, the president from deporting violent gang members, to a prison overseas, which protects American citizens, which is one of the biggest reasons, as you know, Bradley, that the American people supported President Trump, because they were tired of seeing American citizens, getting raped and murdered by folks that weren't even supposed to be here. They were tired of seeing their loved ones, die of fentanyl. And so you see these judges trying to, basically usurp the power of the president of the United States. And, in the case of the impeachment articles that I dropped for Judge Engelmeyer, it was because he was trying to, he threw down an injunction basically saying that Elon Musk and Scott Bessent over at Treasury, the Secretary of Treasury, could not access the data and the payments that were leaving Treasury. I mean, let's say, Bradley, you were
someone given the power by the president in the executive branch did not have the authority to look at Treasury bureaucrats' information.
I know, and it's wild to me, Bradley, because I watch these Democrats and they're just freaking out over Elon Musk. I think they're more pissed off at Elon Musk right now than they probably are
Clearly,
Trump.
They're blowing up Teslas, right?
They're more furious about the guy who's trying to root out fraud, waste, and abuse, which Democrats talk about, Republicans talk about. We all know it's a viper's nest up here, and it's full of corruption. They're more furious with the guy who's exposing it than they are of the bureaucrats and elected officials that are orchestrating it and profiting off of it. I mean, it's just, I feel like we live in a clown world.
Yeah, we do. Oftentimes. And you'd think that they would be happy that people are exposing fraud, waste, and abuse if they want to protect all of the government benefits that they claim, the American people desperately need and want. Elon Musk has said it over and over and over again. We're not here to cut Social Security. We're here to save it. You got to get rid of the fraud in the system in order for people to have good, dignified retirements. It's fair enough, man.
They would have you believe, Bradley, that there's no fraud in the system.
Oh, of course not.
Which is just, it's so ridiculous on its face.
Even though the Biden administration had to arrest hundreds of people, I think it was, for violations or fraud with the PPP program during COVID.
Of course.
Right?
And, Elon came up to the Hill a couple weeks ago, and he gave us like a 50-minute talk and then opened it up to Q&A. And he had one of his top operations officers there. And one of the things that I found it so interesting, and sad at the same time, he said they were looking at SBA, Small Business Administration, and they said they found out what the oldest living American was, 114 years old. And so they like set their parameters for their search at 115 and older. And they said, we found that there were 3,000 loans given to Americans 115 years and older for $300 million. And then he asked the members, what percentage of those loans do you think were paid back? He said 0. And then they also found about the same amount of money given to Americans that were like 10 years old and younger. I mean, it's just, that
kid has bad credit for the rest of his life.
That's just one issue in one agency, and it's all over the place. I tried to defund USAID last Congress by 50%, and Republicans, Democrats stopped it and Republicans stopped it. We had more Republicans vote against it. And I only knew the tip of the iceberg of, what was going on at USAID. And now that Elon's come in, and been able to look behind the scenes and, bring his computers and his team in there to actually evaluate what's going on there. And we've learned more and more and more. It's kind of like Ukraine. Republicans are starting, I think, to wake up a little bit to, the situation.
Yeah, that is on, this is just about bloated government, out of control government generally. But one more thing on the judge's point, you guys are gearing up for a vote on Representative Iss's bill to limit their authority to enter some injunctions like this, right?
Yeah.
To slow down the president. What do you think of this piece of legislation? Do you think that it's satisfactory? Do you think that it's, you want to have Jim Jordan still do those hearings, but maybe that's the way to do it instead of impeachments? I mean, how are you thinking about this piece of legislation?
Bradley, when it comes to this issue, I've kind of been an all of the above guy. I know Mike Lee has a bill as well. But I would love to see us not only do the hearings, but I would also love to see us, start the impeachment process. And the biggest reason is, Bradley, because I'm not one of these guys that just says, hey man, if we don't win this election, this experiment might be over. I actually believe that. And because I actually believe that, I want to actually do something about it. And I think many of these pieces of legislation, though they're good, I don't think that they would stop these, judges today from doing what they're doing. I think you actually have to use a little bit of political force here. And it's something that I've seen the Republican Congress be unwilling to do, 99% of the time.
Yeah. No use of political force, and yet they keep the funding spigot open more times than not. We've talked about cutting the size of government, cutting government spending for decades up here in Washington, D.C., long before my time, long before your time up here. Seems like we have a chance to actually do it. Right now, as it stands, we're recording this on Tuesday. The House and Senate are involved in negotiations over the budget resolution that will be the rule map or the blueprint for budget reconciliation in that piece of legislation. Right now, of course, the House is saying that they want $1.5 trillion in tax cuts, and that's going to be matched with a certain level of, $1.5 trillion in spending cuts, and that will match onto a much larger tax cut. Could be 4.5 trillion or even more than that. Senate, however, isn't keen, it seems, on cuts, because in their potential budget resolution, which we don't have the text for yet, they are setting a floor of only $3 billion with a B spending cuts. How are conservatives, deficit hawks in the House receiving that message from the Senate? Is it making them nervous about the spending cuts that will actually be able to get done?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And we met with a couple senators last night with the House Freedom Caucus. And, that was one of the questions that got posed. I do know that there are senators that, are on the same page as us. They realize how important spending cuts and kind of getting our fiscal house in order and headed it back in the right direction. But as you know, there are many members in the House and many members in the Senate that want no part of that at all. They just seemingly want to spend more money regardless of, what bill, what agency, et cetera. And so it's going to be a fight. I don't know where we're going to wind up. I don't hold my breath, and I struggle to be optimistic up here, but I can tell you and the American people that there's a handful of us up here who are actually concerned about not only this budget reconciliation bill, but actually what this country's going to look like in 10, 20 years, 30 years for your kids and your grandkids. And we're trying to, turn this thing around. I was talking to a PhD in economics about a month ago down in Florida. And I've always wondered what the number was, Bradley. When does this house of cards finally collapse? Is it $40 trillion? Is it $45 trillion in debt? Is it $50 trillion in debt? And this gentleman told us that according to his modeling, which was pretty in line with many of the other big models out there, he said he believed we had about 17 trillion in debt cap left before we could no longer, sell our bonds.
So you forecast that out if we don't make any sort of cut to government spending.
Well,
that's 9 years?
Hold on. So he went further, Bradley. He said that if you guys extend the Trump tax cuts, that takes it down to about $12 trillion. So if we're running 2 trillion annual deficits, that gives you about 6 years. And he said, and keep in mind, this modeling doesn't entertain that we will go to war or we'll have another pandemic or major national emergencies. And so that was his modeling about 6 years.
So you need to get serious about these spending cuts for getting the fiscal house in order. My last question for you, as you guys start this process, you don't know where you're going to wind up, but if Representative Eli Crane had the keys to the kingdom, what would success look like in budget reconciliation?
Well, obviously we would extend the tax cuts, and there would be serious, budget cuts, to the tune, if I had the say, it would be at least $2 trillion in cuts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Responsible tax policy matched with responsible fiscal policy, right? You can't spend all the money in the world and destroy all of the government's revenue at the same time.
Yep.
It's an important message. Not a lot of people want to accept that message because we are constantly in a debate about current policy baseline versus current law baseline, which we spoke about on the show with Representative Tom Emmer, the House Whip. So check that episode out if you want to learn more about that. But we are out of time. You got to get over across the street back to Capitol Hill. Representative Eli Crane, thank you so much for coming on the Signal Sitdown.
Thanks, Brad. Appreciate it, man.
Of course.